Good evening to our global audience present tonight due to the snowstorm's cancellation of our live lecture scheduled to be held in Manhattan. But I promise you all I will ask John Papadopoulos to return in person next year or the year after. I am Michelle Kidwell Gilbert, Chair of the Archaeology Committee, and delighted to welcome everyone to a virtual program given by returning lecturer and distinguished professor of archaeology and classics at the University of California, Los Angeles. John K. Papadopoulos discusses Sokrates in the Agora, an update on some of his favorite and less favored haunts in collaboration with the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. Allow me a few remarks about this evening's most important subject. I still recall attending the May 12, 2011 retrial of Sokrates as presented by the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation in Manhattan's federal courthouse with its resultant split decision. How have things changed? This very month, Texas A&M University, home to the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, established by the late, great Dr. George F. Bass, instructed Professor Martin Peterson to remove certain works by Plato from his introductory philosophy class. No comment is necessary from me regarding this egregious turn of events. As for John Papadopoulos, we were recently together in San Francisco, attending the Archaeological Institute of America's annual meetings and assorted events, with two of the most splendid lectures given by John himself, as well as his extraordinary wife, Sarah Morris. John has excavated, co-directed, or directed field work widely in Greece, Albania, Italy, and Australia. He is the author or editor of 13 books, over 120 articles, and some 50 book reviews. Since 2022, he is director of excavations at the Athenian Agora. Kindly join me in welcoming this evening's eminent speaker. John, if you will.
Michelle, for that very gracious introduction. I'm going to share my screen so we can get started. I was actually, let me see if this works. Yes, there we are. I was actually in California on Friday, and I'm now in Manhattan. So for those of you living in New York, I feel your pain. And all I can say is that I did not bring the weather with me. So I'm going to get right into it. So this evening, I'm going to talk about an individual, Socrates, okay? And I'm going to talk about a person who has name recognition across 2,500 years. And that's not bad for somebody who never wrote a word. Now, what I'll be doing is looking at his life, his death, of this controversial avuncular character, and I want to visit in particular a number of his favorite haunts in Athens, particularly in the Athenian Agora, places like the Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios and the house of Simon the Cobbler, among others, and some of his less favored places, including the putative, and by that I mean the so-called state prison where he was supposed to die, because there's a lot of controversy whether that's a prison or not. And in so doing, I'm going to present some new and some old evidence. Now, Michelle, in her introduction, talked about the trial of Socrates. Well, in antiquity, in Athens, in the 5th century BC, you could not have a split decision. Okay? Does anybody know how many jurors there were in the trial of Socrates? It was 501. So all they needed was a majority of one, and the person would be either freed or convicted. The average, by the way, was actually 201 for a jury, but we also know of juries of over 1,000 people. Always an odd number. Now, here's the site of one of his favorite haunts, and you can see the Stoa of Atlas to the left, the Hephaestion to the right, the Acropolis in the background, the Hill of the Muses, the Areopagus Hill. This is the heart of the classical beast right here in central Athens. And I show you this reconstructed photograph of the Stoa of Atlas. It was funded by Attalus I of Pergamon in the middle of the 2nd century BC. And it was basically a gift to his alma mater. And I want to show this stoa because it's restored and it gives you a really good idea of what a stoa looks like. And it's actually one of the great things that the United States had given to Greece. If you ever visit the Athenian Agora, and if you can see where my cursor is, my office is just up here. So send me an email and come and visit. And it's very similar to modern marketplaces. Now, the reason why this was the central marketplace of Athens is because it was actually two things. Like most people today, I think the ancient Athenians actually did most of their shopping locally. If they could do it online, they would. And I've noticed all over New York today, the amount of people ordering food into their apartments was incredible. But I suspect that most people shop locally. But why this place became the central marketplace was that it was also the offices of the world's first democracy, built there in the 5th century BC. And so male citizens who were all members of this democracy had to be part of this. Now, this is the underbelly of this great democracy, this radical democracy of Athens, was the same ugly underbelly as the founding fathers of the United States. Women, slaves, and resident aliens do not have a say. And I was shocked to find that in places like Switzerland, one of the most progressive countries in Europe, do you know when women achieved federal voting rights in Switzerland in the early 1970s? I also wanted to showcase in this lecture our latest publication project, the Athenian Agora as an urban archaeological park. And and to showcase the interplay of monuments, landscape, environment, biodiversity of the site, and how all of these things interplay with visitors to the site. And this is done through a number of watercolors and sketches of a good friend of mine, Pavlos Kabidis. And these are much more compelling oftentimes than just photographs alone. So you can see this wonderful view of the Acropolis to the right, the Lycabettos Hill to the left. There is the Stoa of Atlas. A detail that shows all of the Stoa that you see here. A wonderful view of the Hephaestion, the best preserved temple in Greece, with people in the lower left. And this is the peopling this wonderful landscape. And two tourists on the right taking a selfie with a Stoa behind them. And on the left, Pavlos captured these two remarkable birds. The central bird that you see is a hoopoe. It's the star of Aristophanes' play The Birds. And the little bird here on the lower central left is a European goldfinch. And he just saw them together on a branch in the Agora and he painted them. And also the objects from the Athenian Agora. Now, our story really begins in the 5th century BC during the radical democracy. And Sokrates emerged as both an important and a controversial figure. And although the sophists, and I'll have more to say about them in a second, were established in the course of the 5th century BC, not everyone thought highly of them. And those who jeered them were the more conservative members of the citizens. So, like us today in our own democracy, we have different factions, different parties. And the people that jeered the sophists saw them as undermining the traditional social values and education system of Athens. Now, many of these people classed Socrates as a sophist, and this in and of itself is problematic because we really don't know much outside of what Plato and Xenophon have to say um, about Socrates, and it's highly unlikely that he himself would ever have classed himself as a sophist. Now, what did happen was that the comic poet Aristophanes, especially in his play The Clouds, ridiculed Socrates as a corrupt teacher of rhetoric. It was this type of teacher that used rhetoric to influence youth and to undermine the social values of the then elite. And this play was performed in the city of Dionysia in 423 BC, and it received, interestingly enough, last prize. It was not popular play. Socrates was accused of being a sophist and being all about spellbounding, meaningless oratory and browbeating. And it says a great deal about the character of Socrates that he and Aristophanes remained apparently on friendly terms. And perhaps part of that reason was that the play was too ridiculously exaggerated to be taken personally. But it does reveal behind the laughter the opinion held by many Athenians of the sophists and of Socrates in particular. So on the left, another portrait of the great philosopher, and on the right, a portrait of Aristophanes. But what do we know about Socrates, the man? Well, we know he was born in 470 or 469 BC or thereabouts. His father was Sophroniskos, a stoneworker, and his mother was a midwife, Phenarete. By the last quarter of the 5th century, he had become a public figure and a central participant in the intellectual debates common in the city at the time. Now, Socrates' philosophy and personality reached a broad ancient audience, mainly through the dialogues of his associates with him as protagonist. And I hasten to stress that none of these were actually written by Socrates himself. The most famous of the writers were, of course, Plato, who went on to found the Academy, and but there were many others, and here I name some of them. Now, many of these others who had talked about Socrates, most of their work is either lost or it survives only in fragments. Now, apart from Plato, most of our information comes from Aristophanes and Xenophon, both of whom knew Socrates personally, and as well Aristotle, who did not know Socrates. Now, although Plato and Xenophon depict him as poor, he must have had some, he must have owned land and sufficient property at some time to qualify for service as a hoplite. And a hoplite is a heavily armed soldier in the Athenian army. He took part in a number of important Athenian battles, including the Battle of Ptidia in Chalkidiki, where he acquired a reputation for courage. Now, he was married to two women, to Xanthippe and to a daughter of Aristides. Which one came first is really unclear in our philological evidence. And he fathered apparently two or perhaps three sons, even that there's some differences in our sources with Xanthippe. But he also liked to have sex with young men. He avoided active participation in politics, though he did serve as one of the presidents, the prytanes, of the assembly in 406 BC. And this was because members of the Senate and members of the prytanes were chosen by lot. And there were only three positions in this radical democracy that were chosen by direct elections. The idea behind this was that any citizen could do the job, any male citizen could do the job. So most of the position were chosen by lot. Now, Socrates' circle was very wide, and it included a number of really important figures of the time, figures who turned against democracy in favor of the oligarchy, the rule of the few. People like Critias, Charmides, and also especially Alcibiades. And this may well have been one of the underlying reasons why he himself was tried and put to death in 399 BC. So, although he was put to death, he had a good innings. He lived for 70 years, which in the 5th century BC Athens was virtually unheard of. That was a good and old age. But he was not charged formally for this. The underlying reason why he was charged was impiety, specifically for introducing new gods and for corrupting the youth. A charge that clearly marked the political motives of his accusers. So, just like people are accused falsely of all sorts of things today by those in power, so too the same thing happened to Socrates. His execution was in the state prison, not far. Its location was not far from the Athenian Agora in 399 BCE. But what do we know of the critical buildings that featured in his trial? And the story really does begin with the royal Stoa, or the Stoa Basileus, and it ends with the state prison. Now, where where it all begins is here, and it's the royal Stoa or the Stoa Basileus, and where it ends was the so-called, the putative, the Sogenannte, as Germans would say, prison, which is located, according to Eugene Vanderpool, and we'll talk about this in a moment, which was located just down here on the lower left of the screen. Now, I'll show you a detail. This is what the Stoa Basileus and it begins here because in 399 BC, Socrates had to present himself to the Archon Basileus to see if there was enough evidence, and this was to be determined by the Archon Basileus, if there was enough evidence to send him to trial. The Archon decided that there was, and the rest was history. But what's important about the location about this building is that here is the canalization of the Eridanos River, which happened in 460 BC, and here is the Great Drain. And the exact date of the Great Drain is remains unknown, but it was dug and it was lined and it was put into place sometime in the early 5th century BC. And what's important about this is that you could not have put this building in this space until the river had been canalized in the 460s BC and the Great Drain was put into place, say in 485 or 470 or so BC, early 5th century. So the Stoa Basileus, or the Royal Stoa, had to have moved from the archaic Agora sometime around 470 or in the 460s BC. This is a drawing of what the Stoa reconstructed would have looked like. And here's a model that was made by John Travlos, and it features the laws, the ancient laws of the Athenians, the Kirbes and the Axones, and these were on public view for all to see. And this is what the area looks like today in a wonderful watercolor by Pavlos Chabidis. What I'm pointing out here is the Great Drain, and you can see that the modern ground level today is about 4 meters above the ground level in the 5th century BC. This was one of the lowest, swampiest parts of Athens. You could not build anything here until the Great Drain went into place and until the river Eridanos was canalized. And if you stand at the current entrance, you also see, of course, the railway tracks, and this is the northern end of the Stoa of Zeus. Now, as for the state prison, it was the great Eugene Vanderpoel who actually argued that a certain building that had been found in the Agora could have been the state building. Now, he first aired this way back when I forget whether it was in the late 70s or in the early 1980s, but Sarah Morris was at the AIA meeting where Eugene Vanderpoel first spilled the beans about this so-called the prison. And I wish I was there. I actually met Eugene in his when he was an old man living in Athens in the early 80s. And here is a photograph, one of the earliest we have of the Agora staff in the 1930s. This is 1932. And the person right in the center standing, the very good-looking young lad, that's Eugene Vanderpoel. And his wife to be is Joan. And you can see Joan Bush Vanderpoel right here on the left in the second row. Here he is again in the center with the first director of the Athenian Agora, T. Leslie Shears Sr., the second director, Homer Thompson there, and Dorothy Burr Thompson there. And there is Joan Bush Vanderpoel sitting down next to Lucy Talcott in the front row. Here is Eugene Vanderpoel, and Eugene was one of my heroes. I mean, Eugene was one of the few Americans who, in the early 40s, decided where most of the Americans left Greece while they could, while the Mediterranean was still open to U.S. shipping, and he decided to stay on in Athens. He continued his work in the Agora until he was arrested by the Germans and put into a prisoner of war camp abroad. And he had to, in fact, walk and was partly driven back to Greece after the end of the Second World War. And this is the reunion with his wife, Joan, at their estate at Germi. Now, the building that Eugene thought was a state prison was this. And it probably is a house, and it has this large courtyard here. And part of and this is what it looks like today. And I actually got Pavlos to draw this, and Pavlos was just looking at me and he said, "Man, what is this? This is just crap here. I mean, there's nothing to see here. What am I drawing?" And this is the watercolor he came up with. It's only the ruins of the foundations that Pavlos was able to sketch with minimal use of watercolor. But part of the reason was the discovery of these things, these little thimblefuls that Eugene thought were to dispense the hemlock, the deadly poison that Socrates was to take. Now, Plato, in the Apology, provides us with a record of the speech that Socrates made in his own defense. And if you want to know more about this, read Plato. And I'll come to the 4 dialogues that actually talk about the trial, but the Apology is among the more important. And although he could almost certainly Socrates, that is, have escaped into exile, a result that many of his accusers would have very likely wished for. They said, we just want him out of the city, get rid of him. And this was a way to get rid of him. He died in prison by voluntarily staying in Athens and drinking the hemlock administered to convicted criminals. Now, these small thimble jars found in the building thought to be in a state prison were believed to have been the containers for the hemlock. Bronwyn Wickester, one of the wonderful professors from here, from New York, who works at the Athenian Agora, has written a lot about these. And rather than being containers for poison, they were containers for medicine. And it's very interesting that in ancient Greek, as in modern Greek, the word for poison is pharmaki, and the word for medicine is pharmakos. And I think where general consensus is right at the moment is probably that this is not a state prison, but a normal 5th century BC house. And it does look like one very close that had been excavated nearby. But let's leave it open. And this is Jacques David's 1797 painting of the trial and the death of Socrates about to drink the hemlock. Whatever Jacques David had in mind, the state prison of Athens in the 5th century looked nothing like this. There were, however, profound differences between Socrates and the sophists. And I don't want to get into these because this is really a lecture this is a real, by itself, another lecture. But there was the infamous story of the Delphic oracle that famously said that Socrates, was the wisest of all men. And Socrates himself could not at first believe this. Eventually, after going around and asking all of the so-called experts, he concluded that, after all, the oracle at Delphi was correct, because he alone was aware of his own ignorance. He alone was aware of his own ignorance. His commitment to do what was, according to him, the right thing was unwavering. Plato's Socrates is cool, distant, reticent, and ironic. And this is in contrast in many ways to Xenophon's Socrates, who is more conventional, much more straightforward, much more down to earth, this truly avuncular, uncle-like character. The trial and death of Socrates is dealt with in 4 dialogues by Plato: the Erythro, the Apology, the Crito, and the Phaedo. And for those of you who have not read them, do yourselves a favor. They're actually a lot of fun. Now, Socrates' moral seriousness was counterbalanced by a worldly personality, a person who enjoyed good food and company. And he has that uncanny ability, if we believe both Plato and Xenophon, not to do anything wrong, like he was always right. Now, these features, along with the vividness with which Plato portrays his complex personality, are responsible for the fact that so many ancient philosophical schools considered him as the person most closely approximating their respective ideal. Now, with the renewal of the study of Greek texts in the Renaissance, Socrates became an influence on modern philosophy as well, and this is largely through Plato's dialogues. And this is also reflected in art. I show you this pretty mediocre painting of the Victorian era, but the painting I really wanted to show you was Raphael's School of Athens, that feature right in the center Plato on the left and Aristotle. And this is what the painting looks like that was painted by Raphael in the 16th century. Socrates does provide us with the first model of the quintessential philosopher, devoted to the pursuit of ethical ideals. His pursuit is systematic, and his emphasis is on knowing the definitions of virtues, and this provided an impetus in and of itself for the development of logic. More than this, he still constitutes a sort of paradigm figure in whom philosophy, even in its most abstract manifestations, is never severed from the concerns of life. He lived, and this is very important, he died in accordance with his own philosophical principles, and this is important. And Plato's lively portrait of his teacher and friend makes it believable that such a figure, such a person, is possible. And this is why he's remained so popular in the modern world, even though he never wrote a word that survives. And since so many of his principles are not always clear, or that we have to rely on the information of others, Socrates continues to constitute something of a mystery with which anyone interested in philosophy or in the writings of the ancient Greeks must contend. This is a detail from Jacques David's painting, another portrait of the great man, and one of his favorite haunts. Now, what I want to do for the rest of my time is to give you something of an overview of our new field work and to focus on a number of buildings that Socrates really loved, okay? And also not so much on the buildings that he really hated. And I always hate to begin a lecture. Um, I always hate to put the people I have to thank at the end of a lecture. I usually put it at the beginning, but here I decided to put it in the middle. And I wanted to thank all of the people listed here for their generosity and hard work, particularly my colleagues and friends in the Greek Ministry of Culture, David Packard and the Packard Humanities Institute. For funding so much of the critical work in the Athenian Agora, the American School of Classical Study and its staff, and especially the current director, Bonner Westcott, and a special thanks to my colleague and good friend, John McKesson Camp II, who was my predecessor, who taught me so much about the Athenian Agora, and all the members of the Agora staff, as well as the numerous donors, and I mentioned a few of these there, as well as the many more anonymous donors, and the many volunteers and specialists who have made it a privilege for me and a great pleasure to work at this wonderful site. So here we are again at this wonderful site, the heart of the classical beast. And I want to show you a small video that features the Stoa brand new, listening clean, as it was in the early 50s. It opened to the public in 1953. This is what it looks like today. And if you look upstairs, just about right here, if you ever come, just about there is where my office is. So do come and visit. So this video just goes through, and one of the problems we're currently facing, and it's a basic problem at all archaeological sites, not only in Greece but all over the world, all over the Mediterranean, is storage. We have dug and we've dug and we've dug for 4+ generations, and now we don't have enough space to store things. And this is a problem that we have to resolve. The amount of fines is enormous, and this video gives us some idea. There are approximately just under 200,000 artifacts that are both recorded in a card system as well as in our digital database. Here you see some of the storage in the basement. And what this building does desperately need is an overhaul and a renovation so we can get more stuff into it. Now, upon assuming the directorship of the Athenian Agora at the end of the summer of 22, my first task was a major job of demolishing a building that had been there. And my predecessor, John Kemp, really wanted to the expropriation for this building to go forward and for him to demolish it. But this did not happen. So I want to show you the before, during, and after. This is the before, and this is the central building that we demolished. And here I'm just going to show you a fraction of a short video that shows the demolition in progress. I'm not going to focus on this because it's heavy machinery showing this happening. But this is the sort of stuff that I wasn't trained to do at grad school. So here it is after that building was removed. This is after, this is the beginning of the first season, or just after the beginning of the first season when we're preparing the area for the trenches. Now, this could not have possibly been done without the great assistance of this guy, Craig Mosey, deputy director of the Agora, photographer, and jack of all trades, who finally, after 40 something years, do the math, stepped down to a much deserved retirement in December of 2025. So thank you, Craig, for all your hard work. Now, by demolishing this building, we had this large, pristine area. And so I decided to do the first geophysical prospection that was ever done in the Athenian Agora. And we did this in 23 and in 2024. And the person responsible was Brian Damiada, assisted by Pavlos Soteropoulos, and also by Vasilis Sakas from the Department of Geophysics and Geothermy at the University of Athens. And although we tried various different geophysical techniques, we actually found the ground penetrating radar as well as frequency domain electromagnetic surveys were the best. And this is the ground penetrating radar. This is with Soteropoulos. And we started getting images like this. So you can actually begin to see walls appearing. And this is at a distance of about 2.5 meters. Once you go down to about 5 meters underground, this is where the frequency domain electromagnetic survey equipment came in. And this is Vasilis Sakas from the University of Athens doing that. And this produced even more interesting images that had to be ground truthed. We also did a little bit of geophysical work in the area of the Tholos in 2024. But the important point was where in the area where we're currently digging, which is north of the entrance, on the other side of Hadrian Street in Monastiraki, the trenches were actually the trenches that I laid down that were laid down on the basis of the geophysics. And this area really does represent one of the last pillars of dirt in central downtown Athens of the 5th century, ideal for exploring organics, especially for exploring foodways. And the closer you get to the Acropolis, the older the deposits get. So we go back, if we go to the Acropolis, to the north slope of the Acropolis, to the late Neolithic and final Neolithic periods. On the south slope of the Athenian Acropolis, it goes even earlier to the middle Neolithic, to the 6th, or perhaps even to the 7th millennium. So this was a project, because this was a large pillar, and here of dirt, that we could sieve and we could perform water sieving systematically on all the units excavated. We, in this area, could go back to the Middle Helladic period. That's roughly beginning sometime around 2500 BCE. Um, and we could actually see what people were eating, what people were defecating, right until 2022 and 2023. And the systematic retrieval of all the animal, plant, and shell remains was headed by John McMarsden, who's at Boston University, assisted by one of his grad students, Angela Zhang. The faunal remains, the animal remains, are studied by Jackie Meyer of the University of North Florida and Katie Tardio of Bucknell. The shells, the sheath shells and land snails are done by Kanan Chakila and Elenika Saidou from Groningen University, and the phytoliths by Mary Larkham, who was formerly at Washington University at St. Louis. So we were actually able to retrieve it all, everything, all the seeds, all the organic material. And here's just a little bit of it. Barley, wheat, figs, grapes, olives, lentils, peas, pistachios, the full shebang. Um, and here are the ubiquity values, the various taxa, and the phytoliths. Now, phytoliths um, are fossilized remains of water that goes through plants. Now, as water is sucked up by a plant, it carries with it some silicon. And the silicon that goes through the plant takes the shape of the plant. This is the phytolith. And this then preserves as a small stone, a small lithic that cannot be seen by the naked eye, but you can see it under a microscope. And these are some of the phytoliths that Mary was looking at. And Mary comes to me after a month of what she was doing in 2023. She said, John, there's all this wacky weight in this area. What's this all about? And I said, Mary, what on earth do you mean by wacky weight? She said, there's this weight that did not exist in antiquity, and it didn't exist in the Byzantine period. Wheat like Durham wheat, which is today what they make pasta out of. And she said, there are all these modern wheats. So I had a big grin on my face. And she said, why are you laughing? And I said, well, Mary, the biggest building in this area that was demolished was a former flour mill. She had found evidence by studying the phytoliths of the wacky wheat. This actually proved to me that her work was valuable and that this was something worth pursuing. Now, excavations were located in the area underneath the demolished field, the building that we demolished. A special shout out to Debbie Sneed, the field supervisor, as well as to all the wonderful supervisors who dug the trenches, the photogrammetrists, the photographers, the pottery analysts, the sherd nerds, as I like to call them, especially Professor Nick Hudson from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, who does the Roman pottery, Professor Fortuny Condili at the University of Virginia, who does the Byzantine and post-Byzantine pottery, and one of my own former students, Dr. Trevor Van Dam, who is currently teaching at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. And we started in Sector BK, and we're still very much in modern Ottoman and Byzantine levels. If you're really keen to see anything of the 5th century BC or earlier, maybe we could do a repeat of this lecture in about 30 to 35 years. I'm going to focus on two pits that we found, and one of the pits actually gets down to those levels, to the 5th century BC levels. Now, one of these pits is a likely well, the other is probably for the processing burning, that is, of seashell, to produce lime. And we have really well stratified and well represented Middle Byzantine levels dating from the 10th to the 13th centuries. So here is a domestic quarter of the Middle Byzantine period. This is well A that I'll talk about first. This is in the lower right, just off center, which is square. And this is pit B, which I'll also talk about, which is circular. So, Middle Byzantine, we have both domestic and industrial deposits. Now, here is the likely pan because John Camp, my predecessor, was actually able to get the southwest corner of the painted Stoa. And because of that, he also managed, if you look right at the upper right-hand side of the frame, he got part of the north eastern end of the building, and he also got a bit of the back wall. And what was exciting about this pit B that became very clear soon after we started digging was that the back wall of the Stoa was going right through the pit. So perhaps we could get part of the back wall. But let's first look at the Middle Byzantine remains that were over here. I show you on the left what they look like colored, the various deposits, and I won't bore you with details. So let's go to the two pits. Pit A is this thing down here, the square pit, and this is what it looked like when we first encountered it. This is a photogrammetric model of what it looked like at the end of last season, the summer of 2025, and we have not yet reached the bottom, but we have reached the water level. So the date of the construction has to remain until we get the bottom, but we know exactly the date of the fill. And this is very clear from the plastic objects. Now, most people in all excavations in Greece just throw this crap away. This is garbage just to be discarded. No, keep it all. What you see here on the left are two canister lids of an Italian petrochemical company that did work in Athens between 1950 and 1970. We also found ice cream spoons made of plastic with the EVGA logo in a diamond like this. This logo was only around from 1964 to 1985, as well as plastic cups dating to the same era. You cannot get a closer date than this for this deposit. It's as good as it gets in archaeology. And I'm proud to say that I'm going to be the first director of the Athenian Agora that's going to publish plastic. Now, for those of you who are scholars of ancient Greek, the epigraphers in the audience, I would actually bet you my bottom dollar that it's easier for me to read an ancient Greek inscription than it is to decipher what these numbers and letters are saying here. I challenge you to that as well. So all this was aided, and here we go. All this aided in the dating of similar pits that were dug in earlier seasons. So here is our pit A again, and this is a very similar pit, same depth, same dimensions that John Camp dug with two of the volunteers in it. Both were probably wells. And you can see from this schematic Harris matrix that it's well above all of the Byzantine levels. Now, pit B, the circular pit, which is right there, is larger. And it was probably, as I mentioned before, for the firing of shell. This is a photogrammetric image, and this is the wall, the upper part of this pit, or in fact, when it served as a pit, its totality was actually faced with stonework. And our photogrammetrist, Luis Rodriguez Perez, a PhD student at UCLA, photographed it and laid it all out for us. And so this is one of the supervisors, or both of the supervisors, and we actually got part of the back wall, the tikobate, the foundation block of the back wall of the painted stoa. If it is the stoa, the painted stoa, the stoa Poikile, and not the stoa of the Herms. And I'm just going to very quickly show some of the finds, everything from Roman period sculpture to Turkish pottery, Hellenistic figurines, more marble of the classical period, Athenian black figure pottery of the Archaic period, Turkish tobacco pipes, and here's a whole selection of a few more. Now, the Stoa Poikile, the painted Stoa, though popular with many ancient philosophers, and this was especially true for Zeno from Kition on the island of Cyprus. Zeno from Kition actually so much liked to give his lectures in this Stoa that his school of philosophy came to be known as the Stoics because he did all of his lectures in the floor, on the ground of the painted Stoa. But ironically, the painted Stoa, which was begun to be built when Socrates was a mere infant, did not feature in any of the accounts of Socrates' own philosophy. Socrates' favorite Stoa was actually the Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios, which was a later Stoa built in the 5th century, but in the 420s BC, when he himself was at the height of his intellectual powers. And this was the place that he loved to hang out. Two of the Platonic dialogues were set in the Stoa of Zeus, the Erichies and the Theagies, and unfortunately, the authenticity of both is strongly disputed. But Xenophon also has Socrates conversing with Ischomachos in the 5th century BC in the Stoa of Zeus. Now, the Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios was one of several defining buildings on the west side of the Agora, where all of the buildings of the radical democracy were based. And these were all located below the temple of Hephaestus, which Pavlos Kabidis, my artist friend, just loved to paint. So this is a photograph. The Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios is just off to the right of this image. And here are some more of the watercolors of Pavlos showcasing the Hephaestion, which is also known as the Thesion in the modern world, because early scholars thought it was the temple of Theseus, not Hephaestus. The temple of Theseus is, of course, in the Archaic Agora, which is not in this area. It's on the other side of the hill, but that's a whole different lecture. And here are some more images, some details of the metopes of the Hephaestion, and a wonderful watercolor of Pavlos sitting inside the Hephaestion, making a sketch and a watercolor of people looking at the building from the outside. And here's another image of his. Now, the Hephaestion, also known as the Thesion, was also where King Otto arrived when he entered Greece. The kingdom was established in 1832. Otto arrived at Nafplion, the first capital, in 1833, and in Athens in 1835. And we have two great paintings I'm just about to show you. The first is by Karl Stieler. It's a portrait of the king, and the second is by Peter von Hesse. And this is the portrait by Stieler, and this is the wonderful entrance. And there's the Hephaestion in all of its glory with King Otto just to the right of center. And since we're smothered in this snowstorm, I just wanted to show you that it does actually snow in Athens. And this is a wonderful view of the Hephaestion in snow, and my favorite photograph of the Hephaestion under snow is this, taken by a good friend and colleague, Annie Hooton. Now, the Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios. The back part that you see in the upper frame here was an addition in the Roman period, but the main building is what you see outlined in black. And it's a very controversial building, and it's a very influential building because it's the first pie-shaped stoa we have, and it was, for that reason, very influential in Greek architecture and other parts of the Greek world. This is how Homer Thompson and John Travlos restored it, and they restored it with acroteria, and acroteria do not ever belong on stoas. And Homer Thompson was convinced that the acroteria were actually on this building because they were found just 12 meters away from it. And this is one of the acroteria that was found at about 12 meters from the northern end of the portico. And it is, in fact, one of the finest examples of late 5th century BC sculpture we have in captivity. It's probably the single finest statue we have in the Athenian Agora. And this is my favorite painting of the Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios, showing a cat and a tortoise. And here are the standing columns as they are preserved today. Now, which one of these would you call Sokrates? You take your own guess. There are many cats in the Agora, and Pavlos just adored capturing them in watercolors and in sketches. And this one is actually fed by the staff, especially the registrar, Aspasia Evstathio. This cat is called Canella. Canella in Greek means cinnamon. So this is the cat with a cinnamon coloring. Now, when Socrates was done pontificating at the Stoa of Zeus, he would walk past the monument of the eponymous heroes and head for the house of Simon the Cobbler. And here's a wonderful watercolor of the monument of the eponymous heroes with people walking in different directions. And this is the home of Simon the Cobbler. And you can see it on the right frame here. And on this plan, it's located just near the bend of the Great Drain. And right beside the wall, just here, is this Horos inscription that says, Horos ime tes agoras. I am the boundary of the Agora. And this was one of several markers. And we have two in situ, and we have fragments of an almost complete third example, and fragments of a few others that were set up in various parts to demarcate what was public land from private land. Now, you may well ask me, John, why is this the house of Simon the Cobbler and not just some 5th century BC house? Well, the reason is because of what we found. Here are some of the telling evidence. These are bone eyelets for Greek leather boots. And this is what you pass the string. And these were hobnails that were bent in themselves. This is hammered into the bottom and then curved around. And these actually provided the leather with traction so you could actually walk in snow. And the smoking gun, a wine cup with the name Simonos, Simon. It doesn't get better. When Old Man Shear found this in 1938, bang, he had the Agora and there was the Horus inscription right next to it. So there's the Horus inscription again in a watercolor by Pavlos. We also did the neighborhood, the Vrisaki neighborhood, an exhibit at the Makarianis wing of the American School in 2024. This is what the exhibit looked like. This was the neighborhood, and this involved the American School purchasing 367 houses and demolishing them and displacing 6 to 8,000 people, most of them Asia Minor refugees. And between 1931 and 1940, Old Man Scher had removed 246,000 tons of dirt, 250,000 tons of dirt in 10 years. Now, one of the few things that was kept was this. It was a fresco above the door. And this is what it looked like, gathering dust in the basement of the Stoa. And when I became director, I just had to take it down and get it sent to a Byzantine restorer who was Yorgos Mastrogiannis, somebody who's worked for the Benaki Museum in Athens. And from this, he cleaned it up to make it look like this. And this was the showcase. But when the workmen were taking down this fresco, they dropped from the back this lunate piece of rusted iron. And if you look carefully at this, you can actually see traces of painting. So I said to Yorgos, can you clean this thing up? And he said, yeah, no problem. So I gave it to him, and this is what it looked like after he finished. It is the entire life cycle of St. Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, the grandmother of Jesus Christ. We also had Michalis Bardanis studying all the modern bricks of the neighborhood of Athens, and here is a selection of him. And here he is, there is Michalis teaching our volunteers about the modern bricks. I also wanted to showcase the activity of the Steinmetz Family Foundation Agora Fellow, who's our educational officer on site, teaching in Greek and in English, and also in Italian. Also in the Makriyanis wing of the American School for exhibitions, as well as Zoom sessions with schools in the United States. Here is Ior Victorato, our current Steinmetz Fellow, with some disabled Greek students. And here she is conducting a Zoom meeting with a class in the LA Unified District. Another thing that I initiated in 2023 was a series called the Agora Scholar Speaks. These are all on the American School website, and these were inspired by the NPR interviews of people, and it was my own desire. I mean, how I wish we had video footage of the greats of the Athenian Agora, the great archaeologists of bygone eras, of Carl Blegen, of Christos Tsuntas, of Hetty Boyd Hawes, and all of these wonderful archaeologists of Hetty Goldman, Harriet Boyd Hawes, in the past. And here she is. Let me just go back. This is with Sylvie Dumont on the left and with Nick Hudson on the right. And here she is with Bronwyn Wickerster, who studied those medical vials. And we also have monthly social media posts. These are all archived. Now, look at this. This is a photograph that was taken in the late 70s or early 80s, but there's something weird about it because among the people who were looking down at the excavation above the Stoa, the Royal Stoa, is right here, if you focus, a chimpanzee. That's what's wrong with this photo. There was a chimpanzee who's looking at the excavations as intently as any human. But we also initiated a LiDAR model. We printed on a 3D printer models. This was all done by terrestrial LiDAR. These are photographs on the upper left at the center. This is the LiDAR model. And let me show you a brief video of it. And here it is. We're coming to the end, so I'll just go through this quickly. It runs for about a minute, but it shows us all the details of the interior and the exterior of the building done with a terrestrial LiDAR unit. This is the vaulted Byzantine roof that was probably made around the 6th or to the 8th centuries after Christ. We also see displacement of the column drums, and part of this study of the LiDAR was to look at how stable the building is over the years. The other thing that was interesting was that a German scholar working at about around the time when King Otto came to the Hephaestion actually studied the painted decoration on the inside of the building. His name was Gottfried Semper, and Gottfried Semper had made a number of spectacular watercolors of what the painted decoration of the inside of this building looked like. And this is painted decoration that we can no longer see today. So, polychromy. This is one of the watercolors that Gottfried Semper made. I mean, a magnificent thing. But the question was, does this really exist? Is that really on the monument? And so, in order to prove this or to disprove this, I called in Vinzenz Brinkmann and Ulrike Koch Brinkmann, his wife, who are specialists on ancient color. And here they are with Craig Mosey and Debbie Sneed. And we closed the lights shining on the Hephaestion one evening in June of last year. And he started photographing just with handheld cameras. And the little bright spots that you see were all picked up by infrared that picks up Egyptian blue. So the painting is there. So next summer, we're planning a much more careful study where we're going to build scaffolding, bring in even better equipment, and do the whole thing. And I wanted to end with a big thank you to all the members of the 2023 to 25 team. But this year, 2026, is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America, 4th of July, 1776. And I begin with three mangas. And if you don't know what a mangas is, ask a Greek friend. John Stuart Mill, Pericles, and Abraham Lincoln. John Stuart Mill, in the Edinburgh Review of 1846, said, if the issue of the day was any different, and had the Persians defeated the Athenians, either at the Battle of Marathon or at the Battle of Salamis, we today may never have had democracy. Think about that. Had the Persians won on the battlefield at Marathon or at Salamis, they would have destroyed this fledgling democracy just as it was getting going. Pericles, who died in the Great Plague in 429 BC, Thucydides reconstructs his famous funeral oration in his book. And in that he says, and I just quote snippets, it's a much longer speech that takes about 15 minutes. We have a form of government that does not try to imitate the laws of neighboring states. We are more an example to others than they to us. In name, it is a democracy because it's managed not for a few people, but for the majority. Now, this is what Abraham Lincoln had to say in 1863. His short 12-minute address after the battle on the battlefield of Gettysburg, which concluded with the following paragraph. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of their devotion. That we here resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this new nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government for the people, by the people, shall not perish from the earth. It's sad to say that we have a president today and a bunch of clowns in the Congress in Washington, D.C., that would rather work for the few, the billionaires, and not for the majority. Thank you for your attention. Forgive me for going over time. Michelle will never invite me back, but please accept my apologies.
If you can hear me, Michelle will always invite you back, although Michelle is not allowed to be political. I can't stop a speaker. But let me add to what you said, if I may. Abraham Lincoln, you ended with quoting with him, has given us some of our laws about the preservation of monuments also. So, and I had mentioned that, and I had quoted at the time, we had one of our programs on reparations. Um, we've been blessed by many fortunate people in America. So was Greece. As you spoke about some of the battles that took place, I would like to mention both Leocardes from Sparta, who was willing to die along with his men in the hope of preserving Greek liberty. There is always a place in this world for heroes.
As Lord Byron said, Michelle, "'tis something in the dearth of fame, though linked among a fettered race, to feel at least a patriot shame. Earth, render back from out thy breast a remnant of thy Spartan dead. Of the 300, grant but 3 to make a new Thermopylae."
That's really beautiful. And I remember seeing the Thermopylae monument when I was in Greece on a trip with Michael Bennett from the Museum of Fine Arts in St.
Which was
Petersburg.
dedicated by the American government in 1952.
You can see why we get along,
Yeah.
clearly. um, this was wonderful. You gave us so much more than I expected. I have to say to our audience, because of the inclement weather and the way everything transpired, there was no time, as I often arrange it for my committee, to get some questions. So I said to John, you could have additional time. Um, And he took it, we have an insight into the Agora. I never anticipated getting the Byzantine period, those early Christian monuments, and some of the others I thought were fabulous to see and absolutely fascinating. I can't wait another 30 years. John, you and I are not going to be here, to be honest. But I do look forward to other programs of this. But one warning I do want to give. Sometimes people get complacent. And that to me is part of the meaning of the Parthenon that was given to me by Paul Cartledge, who's going to be talking about Pericles. And Paul said, remember also the sack of Troy, that even the Greeks, with all the beauty that they stand for, we all make mistakes in life. And the issue is how we go on, how we correct, and how we build a better world. So, with that in mind, let me just tell everyone we have a fabulous in-person talk. The weather should be withstanding. It's going to be with Brian Rose on
Oh,
an early
great.
plan. Brian is amazing
Yeah.
for the Pantheon. He's one of our greatest speakers of all time, as are you, John. So I thank everyone for joining us. This program will be put online thanks to Nadine. And tell if you aren't watching it, Hopefully your friends will tell you about it so you can view it after the fact. I thank you very much, Nadine, for all the assistance in bringing this to fruition, and John for giving us so much more than I anticipated. When you said to me, Michelle, I've just discovered something new about Socrates on the Agora. And I said, wonderful, let's have a program. That was like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So thank you very much. And my best to all for being here.